Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. Relations between Turkey and Israel, already strained since October 2023, could be entering a more volatile phase. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has described Turkey as the new Iran, framing Ankara not simply as a critic of Israeli policy, but also a growing strategic threat. The comparison is drawing scrutiny, particularly given recent events. Israel and the United States carried out strikes last year against Iran, and tensions with Tehran remain high amid fears of renewed military action. Adding to the controversy, during a recent interview, U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee suggested Israel could extend control across much of the Middle East. His remarks drew immediate condemnation from multiple countries, including Turkey. That rhetoric comes amid sharp disagreements over Gaza, where Ankara has been one of Israel's most vocal critics. Israel's expanding military operations into Syria are also raising alarms in Ankara. So what's behind the sharp turn in language? Is it election positioning, or is Israel attempting to establish a more confrontational policy towards Ankara? For more, joining me now from Istanbul is Matthew Bryzel, former U.S. ambassador. From Cairo, Ramzi Al-Zadin Ramzi, the former undersecretary at Egypt's foreign ministry, and from Ankara, Gülru Gezer, a former Turkish diplomat. Well, quite a experienced panel. I think amongst the three of you, we have, 6 or 7 decades of diplomatic experience, and that's exactly what we need to hammer out this issue. Now, a lot's been happening on the Israel front, especially following that interview between U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee and American podcaster Tucker Carlson. Matt, I want to begin with you. You're a former U.S. ambassador, but before I pose the question, I want all of us to listen in to what Mike Huckabee said during that interview.
This particular area that we're talking about now, Israel, is a land that God gave through Abraham to a people that he chose. It was a people, a place, and a purpose. We can look at it that way.
I think it says from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, once again, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave that land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean?
It would be fine if they took it all.
It would be fine if they took it all. Matthew, you're a former ambassador, so you've been in that position. I want to ask you, is this out of the ordinary? Is this diplomatic, acceptable diplomatically? And also, you've been at the State Department. I mean, you were a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State as well. What's going on at the State Department? What's going on with Rubio when he's watching this?
Yeah, Yusuf, it's startling to hear that sort of language. It's really an example of diplomatic unprofessionalism and an instance of putting one's religious beliefs before their duty to their country and to their president, which is whom any ambassador is serving. I had an example where that caused me great pain when I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. There was some language that I was ultimately responsible for in the State Department report about Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh. And I agreed to one of my subordinates pressing to just dub it Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan's region of Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 surrounding regions, without saying Azerbaijan's 7 surrounding regions. And I suffered brutally from my Azerbaijani friends, and then from my own superiors and colleagues at the White House, because I allowed us not to underscore that these regions around Nagorno-Karabakh are also Azerbaijani. That was it was an omission of one word. What Ambassador Huckabee said is a radical departure from U.S. foreign policy, and he is being pressed to resign. The White House is now trying to pivot away from what he said, and the State Department has been in crisis mode in response.
Mm-hmm. Ramzi, now you listened to this statement by Huckabee as well. The Trump administration, up till now, hasn't taken any steps to remove him, no consequences. When you look at that statement and then no consequences coming from the White House, do you get the feeling that The U.S. has now adopted that as policy. I mean, what's going on in Cairo? What's going on in your mind as someone who's held the highest positions inside the foreign ministry of Egypt and also been an assistant secretary general at the United Nations?
Well, Yusuf, it's, of course, most disconcerting to hear something along those lines from a U.S. official. But let me try to unpack this whole thing. First of all, I think what Ambassador Huckabee is saying is highly contentious. I mean, it's not the fact that God gave land to the Israelites. It is a big question mark. Abraham was the father of both Arabs and Jews. So I do not want to get into that, but I highly contest what he is saying. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is I understand that the U.S. administration is reeling back from what he has said. My understanding is that we have been informed that he does not represent U.S. policy. Now, this is important in itself, but not sufficient in my view. It has to be done publicly. My preference is that the U.S. administration has to come out publicly and say and distance himself from what Ambassador Huckabee has said. Now, what happens to Ambassador Huckabee is something for the U.S. administration to decide. But clearly, his position is totally unacceptable. It is counter to historical fact, and I hope that the United States will come out publicly and distance itself from what he has said. I think the consequences are quite serious if this is not being pulled back.
Gülru, is anything less than Huckabee being removed acceptable for Ankara or for any of the Muslim countries that are part of this biblical greater Israel map that Huckabee basically greenlighted in his statements?
Well, Yusuf, just to add to what my esteemed colleagues have said, we already knew Ambassador Huckabee's opinions before he was appointed. And actually, Trump tried to appoint him during his first period, but then he said, "I don't think this is not an appropriate position for me," because way back, nearly 2 decades ago, he said there are no Palestinians, there is no West Bank. So to appoint such a person holding such views to Israel by itself, I think, was a very big mistake. And we can all, the three of us, speak freely because we no longer represent our countries. But when we were in our official positions, we were limited to what the official position of our countries were. So by saying this, he also put the Trump administration and the State Department in a very difficult position. And I completely agree with my Egyptian colleague that the State Department should issue an official statement. We are all expecting this. In our joint declaration, we also mentioned that we are expecting a clarification with regards to the comments of Ambassador Huckabee. The spokesperson of the embassy in Israel coming out and saying, well, the comments were taken out of its context. This is not enough. Or some calls being made to our capitals saying that this doesn't reflect the official policy of the U.S. That is not enough. First, we need an official statement. And secondly, yes, I think he should be withdrawn.
Matthew, there's probably one of the biggest military buildups by the United States right now in the Middle East, at least since the war in Iraq. I want to ask you, what's going on through Trump's mind right now? I mean, how much is Israel pushing Trump? What are America's interests in attacking Iran? And what's the objective if this does turn into a hot conflict? I mean, generally a country has very clear stated objectives, but it seems like, is this to end the nuclear program? Is this a regime change operation? What would be considered mission accomplished?
Yeah, the only thing that's clear in response to your question is that it's totally unclear. And I think in President Trump's mind as well. Maybe the best window into President Trump's thinking was provided in an interview on Fox News by Lara Trump of Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy to the Middle East and to Russia and Ukraine, when Witkoff said President Trump is aggravated that this assembling of the largest amount of U.S. military force, yeah, you're right, Yusuf, since 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq, hasn't persuaded the Iranians to capitulate. So it's as if President Trump thought by brandishing this big stick that he expected the Iranian regime simply to wither away or to step back, which, as anyone knows who even has a cursory understanding of Iran and the Middle East, knows is the opposite of what's going to happen. When threatened, they're going to dig in their heels like any self-respecting country. So I think President Trump, he initially was focused on destroying Iran's capability to make nuclear weapons. He said that the U.S. attack in June had obliterated that capability. And now he suddenly says, oh, Iran is close to being able to develop a nuclear weapon again. So it's contradictory. After Netanyahu visited him before the last round of talks, President Trump suddenly said that, okay, also the United States is demanding limits, as you said, on Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for militants like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. It's not clear if those are still part of the U.S. demands. Maybe regime change is what President Trump seeks. He's threatened to kill the supreme leader before, but then back in June, he reportedly pulled back Prime Minister of Israel Netanyahu and said no, regime change should not be on the table. And then he said, now that we've destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities, we can have actual peace talks. So I think the bottom line is President Trump has talked himself into a strategic corner. He's threatened to use force. He doesn't want to use force. He doesn't want a big war with Iran. But now that Iran has called his bluff, I think he may feel he has to use some amount of military force. And by the way, even though what's assembled in the Middle East and also in Europe, by the way, I mean, I saw 6 KC-135 tankers on the tarmac at Sofia International Airport last week, obviously in preparation for some military action. But even this large assembly of U.S. military force doesn't provide enough capability to sustain a multi-week, or not to mention month, military campaign against Iran.
Mm-hmm. Ramzi, you've worked directly on the Iran file at the International Atomic Watchdog, so you're no stranger to the nuclear program, and I'm sure you understand better than most of the global population of where Iran was and where Iran probably is right now. Now, it seems that there is still a diplomatic opening, but the goalposts keep on changing. You heard Matt saying that it looks like Trump backed himself into a corner. Is there still an open door where diplomacy can prevail, and what will Iran have to give up?
Well, I mean, I think Iran will not give up the right to enrichment, and I think this is guaranteed by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I think it should not. Now, where it can show flexibility is on a number of issues. First of all, we have the stockpile of 400 kilograms that have been enriched to 60%. This is, of course, a proliferation risk. Now, there are a number of ways to deal with it. One is to dilute it, what I think the Iranians seem to have indicated that they're prepared to look at. The other one is to transport it outside of Iran, which I understand the Iranians are refusing to do so. So that is one issue where some compromise can be done. Now, the other issue, of course, is on the level of enrichment that would be allowed in the future. Now, it seems the U.S. is more flexible than what the media is reporting on that issue, and it is possible to have enrichment up to 3.67%, which is sufficient for the nuclear reactors. But let me just indicate one thing, which is quite interesting. Now, as you said earlier, I was the Egyptian permanent representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency at the time when negotiations started in Vienna between 2003 and 2007. At that point of time, Yusuf, what was on the table? It was proposed by the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was to have a pilot project of a few dozen centrifuges, and that's it. And the Iranians accepted that, and the United States, under President Bush Jr., refused. Can you imagine if that was accepted then, where we would be today? So, I mean, now we are in a much more difficult, much more dangerous position. And I think the Iranians have every right to enrich, but of course they have to do it within limits and under very strict supervision by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think that is possible. Now, the issue is it just the nuclear dossier, so to speak, that will be the subject of negotiations, or will there be other things, which the Israelis have been pushing and the Americans have been vacillating? The issue of the proxies and the issue of the ballistic missile. It seems, from what I can discern, is that the Americans may be prepared at this stage to confine the negotiations to the nuclear file. And I think that would be a good thing, because this is what really is threatening to the region and to the international non-proliferation regime. But let me add very quickly, if we are concerned about Iran having the potential to have a bomb, we should be even more concerned about the fact that Israel does have bombs. And therefore, this is an issue, maybe it's not immediate to be addressed, but it needs to be addressed down the road. Otherwise, there will be no enduring stability in the region.
So tensions are very high between Israel and Iran right now, and obviously everything that's happened in Gaza and with many other neighbors of Israel with airstrikes and attacks. But it looks like Israeli politicians are trying to open up a new front, at least rhetorically it seems right now. I want you guys to listen to former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett talking about Turkey real quickly.
I want to be very clear. Turkey and Qatar have gained influence in Syria, are seeking influence elsewhere and everywhere throughout the region. And from here, I warn, Turkey is the new Iran.
Turkey is the new Iran. Now, obviously, Israel views Iran as its archenemy. So is Turkey now identified as Israel's new archenemy?
Yusuf, we're seeing that Israel is trying to create an alternative reality. It has started a disinformation campaign on the media and on social media. And it's doing this because of the fact that Turkey has been one of the most vocal countries in the world with regards to the genocide in Gaza. We called it a genocide before most of the countries did. And because Turkey has been in support of the two-state solution. Now, trying to, I think, equate Turkey to Iran is also against the strategic interest of Israel itself. But we also have to look at where these speeches are being delivered. They're delivered in front of American audiences at a time where the Trump administration is acknowledging the constructive role of Turkey vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis Gaza, the Palestinian issue, its important role in trying to de-escalate the situation between the U.S. and Iran. And Israel is not liking this. And as I've said, they've turned this into a paranoia. It's not only about the Netanyahu government. We're seeing the opposition doing this as well. And I think this is, I find it dangerous in the sense that they're trying to escalate the situation in the region while Turkey is trying to de-escalate the tensions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you said that, because Israel is a country I very closely follow, and I always thought that October elections, if Netanyahu gets voted out, a new Israeli administration would probably have a much more moderate, mild view towards Gaza, towards the rest of the region, want to normalize and want to pick some of the low-hanging foreign policy fruit that would be available to them, because everyone would view them as a clean slate. But you have a guy like Yair Lapid, a liberal Israeli. You wouldn't expect these types of comments supporting a Greater Israel project. Matt, I want to send this question to you. I mean, is this an Israeli state policy now supporting Greater Israel? And in Ankara, when the Turks are hearing this type of stuff, how should they feel? I mean, you understand the Turks very well. You've spent a lot of time in Turkey. You know Turkish officials very closely. Should they view this as a credible threat?
Well, it's certainly a ridiculous and hostile condemnation of Turkey that I don't even know what it means. What does it mean that Turkey is the new Iran? I mean, Turkey is it's a secular country with a Sunni majority, with centuries of not only religious tolerance but multiple Christian communities living here and a vibrant Jewish community. Yes, President Erdogan has harshly condemned Israel's actions against the Palestinians in Gaza, as has practically every government that there is. So I don't even know what they mean. But of course, this is a political threat toward Turkey because it's instrumentalizing propaganda that is not based in any fact in a way to whip up sentiment against the country, apparently, as you're suggesting, for electoral purposes. That is dangerous. The rest of the world, I think, if they're probably not paying much attention to this because the claim is really so ridiculous. But yeah, it is a political threat, and I think what we need now is to tone down the tension in Israel, Gaza, and in relations between Turkey and Israel. I mean, I spent a lot of my diplomatic career embracing and helping to build a strategic partnership between Israel and Turkey. Back when together Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Georgia were helping companies and countries develop the oil and gas pipelines from the Caspian Sea, which is something Israel strongly developed to isolate Iran. And it's so ironic then that a strategic partnership that was based on opposing Iran is now turning into an accusation that Turkey has become that country that both Israel and Turkey were trying to contain previously.
Mm-hmm. Ramzi, obviously inside of this Greater Israel, parts of Egypt are included, and we're also hearing Israeli officials talk about a new Sunni axis or a Sunni alliance. And I mean, when we look at Turkey's geopolitical moves, it's gotten much closer to Saudi Arabia and Egypt over the past couple months. So we can indirectly assume that Egypt and Saudi Arabia are part of that Sunni alliance that Israel seems to be worried about. So the bullseye seems to be getting bigger. What was once non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah and Shia militia growing into states like Lebanon as a target, now Iran as a target, Turkey as a target, and now a Sunni alliance. I guess if the goal is Greater Israel, you would have to have Sunni Muslims as the target. And how does this make you feel? How are you evaluating this statement?
Well, first of all, let me just point out the fact that it seems that Israel always wants to be on a war footing. First of all, the enemy were the Arabs, then it shifted to Iran, and now that threat has been highly reduced, it is shifting to Turkey. So, I mean, this is, I think, standard in Israeli policy since the establishment of Israel, unfortunately, always looking for the enemy to justify being on a war footing. The other thing, of course, is everything Israel has done, and I think for decades, but it became very obvious after Gaza, is that Israel wants to dominate, wants to be the hegemon in the Middle East region. And to do so, it has to dismember Arab states, probably try to do the same thing in Iran, and to try to neutralize Turkey to the extent that it can. Otherwise, it cannot be a hegemon. Now, first, Israel had a problem with the Shiite crescent and the Shiite alliances and their proxies, and now this has been greatly weakened. It has shifted to consider the Sunnis as the adversary. I think this is most unfortunate for a country that professes to want to live in peace with its neighbors. I think this is something that is not going very well at all in my country, certainly, and I can say for many other countries. And it does make it clear that Israel is out to dominate, even if that domination means using arms or using force. It wants to dominate economically, militarily, and politically, and I don't think that's going to happen. So I do hope the Israeli public will understand that this trajectory that their politicians are pushing them in is not sustainable. It is against the long-term interests of Israel.
Guru, I mean, Israel is a country that obviously has an important military, a good economy, technological sectors are blossoming, but I think the major concern of any other Middle Eastern country is mainly the U.S. backing. I mean, when countries are dealing with Israel in the region and there are tensions and countries push back, there's always that thought in the back of their mind about the United States being Israel's #1 ally, always coming to the rescue. How much of that plays in the back of the mind of Turkish politicians when they're dealing with Israel and any type of potential future escalation, whether it be in Syria, whether it be directly between the two countries or anywhere else in the region?
First of all, Yusuf, I don't think that there would be a direct confrontation with Israel because I don't think the United States would want this. Because the United States values Turkey and Israel in the region as a reliable partner. So the last thing they want and the last thing they need is for Turkey and Israel to be in a direct conflict. With regards to Syria, there is or was a de-escalation mechanism that was established. So the U.S. is trying very hard. And when we look at, for example, the joint press briefings between Netanyahu and Trump on several occasions talked highly of President Erdogan and Turkey's role in the region when journalists from most probably Israel asked, trick questions to Trump and tried to corner him to say something negative about Turkey's role in the region, and he didn't. And he said, "Well, I like Erdogan, and Netanyahu and Bibi likes Erdogan." So he was giving the message that I don't want any kind of conflict between the two of you to emerge. It can be either direct or indirect. So, but of course, Turkey knows that the U.S. has and will continue to support Israel. But as I've said, Turkey has no interest to get in any kind of direct conflict with Israel or create any kind of conflict in the region. We already have a lot of conflicts, and within the framework of regional ownership, we're trying to solve these issues, not create new ones.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, where does Israel's blank check with Trump end, or is there no end?
In the history of Israel's existence, there's always been a blank check with the United States. I mean, if there's deeply held emotional attachment to Israel because of history, right? I mean, it really all goes back to the Holocaust and the sense that, which is what Ambassador Huckabee spent a lot of time talking about in his interview, and he went a bit too far. But what he was saying, what Huckabee was saying, is absolutely the perspective of American evangelical Christians, going back to the biblical right. They believe that Israel has to exist as a Jewish state, and not only as a state of all the descendants of Abraham, as Ambassador Ramsey said, which of course includes Muslims. And evangelical Christians are a very important voting bloc of President Trump. So he will never move against Israel if that is going to cost him those votes. On top of that, I think President Trump is sincere in his admiration of Israel. So yes, Yusuf, I believe it is a blank check. And if, it doesn't mean though that, and not a blank check, it's a blank check in terms of the U.S. in principle supporting Israel and the government that's there. But President Trump has reined in Netanyahu in the past, as I mentioned earlier, and as Guru was mentioning too. When President Trump first said, we do not support regime change by Iran during the 12-day war, or whatever it was in June. And then President Trump has also been steadfastly opposed to Netanyahu's apparent plans to annex the West Bank. So it's a blank check in terms of U.S.-Israeli friendship and from a U.S. government perspective, but not a blank check in terms of what Netanyahu's actions are allowed to be. And Netanyahu didn't want a ceasefire in Gaza, and I think Trump compelled him to agree to one.
Mm-hmm. Ramsey, I want to ask you the opposite of that question. What's the limit of the region's tolerance for Israel's actions? I mean, it doesn't seem like Iran is a limit, that bombing Iran is somewhat acceptable for the region. But where does the region finally say, you know what, we need to now push back with consequences that have teeth against Israel?
Well, clearly, Israeli actions vis-a-vis the Palestinians is one issue. I think what has happened in the West Bank, the latest decisions taken by the Israeli government, which in a way are designed to de facto annex the West Bank. I think this is something that is highly disturbing, and action needs to be taken to prevent that from actually being implemented. Of course, what is happening in Gaza, there's no doubt about that. I think we need to really move on to stage 2, where Israel withdraws. I mean, that is absolutely essential. Now, of course, Israeli actions in Syria and Lebanon need to stop. And this is where we are hoping that the United States, because the United States, let's be quite clear about it, is the one country that can influence Israel. And I agree with my American colleague, is that there is a high level of tolerance in Washington when it comes to Israel. And that, I think, needs to change, because what if the United States is preparing to lighten its military commitments in the region to focus on the Asia-Pacific region, it has to accept a regional security system that is stable. That would be the guarantor of security and would supplant the role of the United States. Now, to be able to do that, if it goes along with what Israel wants, which is to basically be the hegemon, I think this is inherently unstable. And I think the United States should understand that and operate on that basis. What we need is a comprehensive, inclusive regional security system that addresses the concerns of all countries, Arab and non-Arab, which includes, of course, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. I think that is what the United States needs to understand. If it continues to support Israeli present policies, I think we will end in another cycle of violence, which we all are trying to avoid. And I hope that President Trump understands that. We will see how things will develop, but I think this is really a strategic inflection point in the region, and I think things need to be looked at very differently from the past.
Gudro, Iran's nuclear program was obviously one of the most important conditions. Its shutdown, one of the most important conditions for Israel, but now it seems that that's been expanded to include enrichment, obviously. Now, Turkey has the Akkuyu nuclear power plant opening up very, very soon, and obviously has its own plans for expanding its nuclear energy and nuclear power inside the country domestically. But quite recently, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan was asked about nuclear weapons by a Turkish journalist during an interview, and he was silent. He was silent and kind of popped a smile at the very end. Could be telling, could be not wanting to comment on the issue as well, because Turkish president has generally been against nuclear weapons. But it does seem that Turkish policy is at a U-turn point. Does Turkey now feel that it needs nuclear weapons to protect itself against a regional nuclear power like Israel that could be a hostile actor?
Well, Turkey's traditional policy, as you've pointed out, Yusuf, has been that we don't want any nuclear power in the region. And remember, before the Islamic Revolution of 1979 in Iran, we were against Iran building its nuclear capacity when Western countries were cooperating with the Shah regime. So, and we see now the consequences of the mistakes that were done in the past. And obviously, Turkey is against any kind of nuclear weapon that Israel does or does not possess. We don't know that. We know, but I mean, so, but of course, Turkey sees it as a threat. But I don't think that Turkey has changed its policy, because our main goal in the region is to have peace, and nuclear weapons won't create an environment of peace in the region. It will only create a greater instability. So I don't think that there is a really a different understanding or a shift in foreign policy with regards to having nuclear weapons.
I want to thank all three of you for sharing your experiences and your views with me, but we are out of time. Matthew, Ramzi, Gülru, thanks for joining me. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.